Y2K show has been entertaining from the West Coast for 21 years.
Oh my God!
Thank you for watching the Y2K show. Thank you for watching the Y2K show. Thank you for watching the Y2K show.
Hey man, I've been out here. I don't know what time it is now, but I've been out here since like 8, 9 o'clock this morning. And I told myself last month that I would do this, so I'm doing it right now. I told myself last month what I would do is I would go out and buy some groceries, spend some money, give somebody cash for their food stamps and stuff. And then I would go out and buy them food. And so here I am, out buying them food. I bought them food. So as you can see, my chair is doing what it's worth. I'm getting more value out of my chair than you can imagine. I'm breathtaking. I'm a little winded too, but look. I got a basket full of groceries right there to share with the homeless. I got some hot dog buns and some hamburgers. I don't know if they're going to be able to cook out here or not, but if they can't, I'll just take it home, cook it, bring it to them when, when I'm done. When I get it all ready, I'll bring it back out to them. I got chips, I got waffles, I got soda, I got ribs. I can cook them. I got this ham, pastrami. I got me some Rockstar, of course. Then I got them some tuna, some menudo. I tried to get cans that had an opener on the top of them. I got on some chili, some hormel. Bread over there. Back here, I got on some apple fritter. I got some Hot Pocket. I got some puffed cheese puffs. I got some top ramen, pasta roni. Down there, I got the goldfish. I got an 18-pack of chips. I got multiple bags of pasta roni. I hope they got hot water somewhere. Then back up in here. Let me put that back over there. Like my new tray. Look at that tray. Look at that tray. It's sitting on there like it was born there. And it's stable and it is on. Look at me in that basket. The extra large basket. And then I got the other basket down here. It's got orange juice and stuff in it. And some sodas. But yeah, I just wanted to stop so that I could record all of what I have here. Now I'm gonna go over and I'm gonna open these bags up, and whatever they can't use, I'll keep and fix it for them. Bring it out to them done when I can. Okay, let's go.
I know you guys saw my Swarte Euro videos. Just wanted to remind everybody before I start today, when we're talking about when you hear white servitude or European, don't automatically think so-called white or pale skin. There was melanated, dark-skinned Europeans. This is information and history they never told us. I mean, we kind of knew, but it's really deep. And we got to start correcting history. We got to start putting it in their face more and more and more. It doesn't matter how many times they're going to say cultural vultures or this is history. This is true. All right? This is Charles V right here. These are Minoan women. That's ancient times. That's like Minoan women. Look at them.
Indeed, not a single English or American sailor or traveler captured at sea by North African pirates between 1600 and 1775 described himself or herself as a white slave or even as white in over 36 published memoirs. Instead, they described themselves as Christian captives, as Christian slaves, and frequently as English slaves. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam, a so-called renegade. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. A migrant whose whiteness marked his or her fungibility, their capacity to be bought and sold, rather than their rights as a political subject.
You hear that?
So this is not what I expected. Not at all what I expected. The argument being that white racial grammar was not born white supremacist. It became that way. So then the question becomes how and why? What led to that evolution and the creation of an ideology of white victimhood and white power?
Now, why is this not being known more widely in America? Why is this being swept under the rug?
We have a gigantic industry in the United States and in the West, which is determined to limit Black people to a slave mentality, to tell them you've been slaves, and the only way you're ever going to get out of that is to rely on the slave mentality of the socialistic welfare democratic system, which is going to subsidize your manumission ever further. Well, as we know, no one ever gets out of his own bondage by someone else doing it for you. It's by your own work that you bring yourself out of bondage.
Governor Northam made a reference to the history of slavery in the Commonwealth during his CBS interview, but he didn't call the first Africans to land on Virginia's shores slaves. Take a listen.
Well, it has been a difficult week. And, if you look at Virginia's history, we're now at the 400-year anniversary. Just 90 miles from here, in 1619, the first indentured servants from Africa landed on our shores in Old Point Comfort, what we call now Fort Monroe. And while in 1619, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant.
And what did the elite do when you see that you're outnumbered by Black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants? You have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. Whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No, pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land. Just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol. to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. So they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly.
So again, we're about to read from this book from Benjamin Franklin. This is a throwback from the Black Jacobite video real quick, and it also helps us understand what we're going to read today. Concerning the increase of mankind, peopling of countries, by Benjamin Franklin. All right, Benjamin Franklin wrote this. All right, this is from 1755. All right, and we're on page 10 of this book, and this is what Benjamin Franklin says point 24, which he's making observations, right? He's given, which leads me to add one remark. He says that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. It's very small. You're the minority. All Africa is black or tawny. Asia chiefly tawny. All right, tawny, a darker complexion, right? Not white. America exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. All right, what is that saying? America is what? Black or tawny, wholly so. All right, Benjamin Franklin, and you know. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, Swedes are generally of what we call swarthy complexion. Swarthy. All right, just in case you don't know what swarthy is, just a quick reminder, we're here in the American Dictionary of the English language. All right, this is actually Webster's 1828 dictionary. All right, I got the official PDF. We're gonna go all the way to the word swarthy. All right, and right here it says swart. Right, almost sounds like steward. Swart, steward, swart, steward. And what they get steward? Did it mean black or dark? What is swart? It says being of dark hue, moderately black, tawny, swarth. All right. Down here it says swart, to make tawny or brown. Swart, an apparition. Swartly. All right. Duskly with a tawny hue. Says swartness, tawniness, a dusky or dark complexion. Dark complexion, right? Dark complexion. Swarthy, being of a dark hue or dusky complexion. Tawny, in warm climates, the complexion of men is universally what? Swarthy or what? Black in warm climates. Is there only warm climates in Africa? No, we have warm climates all over the world, right? The Moors, Spaniards, and Italians are more swarthy than the French, Germans, and English. This says their swarthy hosts would darken all our plains. Swarthy. All right, black, as the swarthy African, it says, right? As the swarthy African. So the African is swarthy, right? Swarthy is a tawny color. Swartish, somewhat dark or tawny. Swarthy, tawny. All right. So you get the picture, right? Swarthy. So an African is swarthy, right? Black, right? So again, he said, Benjamin Franklin, that in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, French, Italians, Spaniards, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, black complexion, as are the Germans. So is the Germans. So who's the real Quakers and Puritans that were coming over here? The Saxons only accepted who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth, he says, according to him, right? So he's saying that the Saxons and the English and his English lineage, right? Not all of the English, we'll see later. I could wish their numbers were increased. He said, I wish there was more white people because it seems that all of Europe is basically swarthy. What do we have here? Right here. This is a runaway ad from the Pennsylvania Gazette, 1747. It says here, runaway, the 22nd instant from James Greenfield of Newland Township, Chester County, an Irish servant man named Robert Clinton. Irish, right? A weaver by trade. He's a middle stature with black curled hair. Black curled hair and swarthy complexion. Hello. Hello. Black curled hair, swarthy complexion. Irish with black curled hair and swarthy complexion. Who are they talking about here? Just let y'all think about that. All right? Look at this. Let's never teach them what swarthy means, so they'll never know. But we missed the You know, we're picturing Irish with red hair, red straight hair, blonde. No, sorry. This Irish got black curled hair, and a swarthy complexion, and about 20 years of age. He was young, all right? Had on when he went away a new felt hat, a dark brown coat, a green jacket, a flaxen shirt, and in fine stock toe trousers. Of course, he had that. He's a European. The so-called Negroes are European. Why did so many so-called black people not go back to their indigenous African culture and clothing after they ran away and gave their kids, instead of dressing like Europeans and giving their kids European names? Well, they were Europeans. They were just doing what was natural for them. I black curled hair, swarthy complexion. Do you guys understand now? So when we're talking about Irish being sent to the Caribbean, Irish being sent to the plantations, don't just assume pale skinned white people. Yeah, this is deep. If you're in the islands, Jamaicans, on any of those islands, Barbados, you got to really think about your ancestry. How deep it is, how much Irish and Scottish could it be? Could it be? You got to go case by case, individual case by case, because can't group everybody under one single thing. Because we have an Irish with black curled hair and swarthy complexion here. All right. All right. So we're in the Encyclopedia Virginia.org website, and it says here indentured servants in colonial Virginia, contributed by Brenda Wolfe and Martha McCarty. And it says indentured servants were men and women who signed a contract, also known as indenture or a covenant, by which they agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for transportation to Virginia. And once they arrived, food, clothing, and shelter. All right, so you see transportation to Virginia. So we're they want us to assume they're talking about Europeans. It doesn't really specify from where, right? But they're gonna, we're just, I guess, in this article, they're just gonna talk about Europeans, or it doesn't say if they're white or more. What kind of Europeans were coming. All right, so that's your own hijack. So it says adults usually served for 4 to 7 years, and children sometimes much longer, with most working in the colony's tobacco fields. Yeah, in the plantations, right? In tobacco plantations. Indentured servitude became, during most of the 17th century, the primary means by which Virginia planters filled their nearly inexhaustible need for labor. That's how they filled these plantations. At first, the Virginia Company of London paid to transport servants across the Atlantic, but with the institution of the head-right system in 1618, the company enticed planters and merchants to incur the cost with the promise of land. So I guess they promised them land after they were done. As a result, servants flooded into the colony, servants, not slaves, where they were greeted by deadly diseases and often harsh conditions that killed a majority of newcomers and left the rest to the mercy of sometimes cruel masters. The General Assembly passed laws regulating contract terms, as well as the behavior and treatment of servants. Besides benefiting masters with long indentures, these laws limited servant rights, while still allowing servants to present any complaints in court. By the end of the 17th century, the number of new servants in Virginia had dwindled, and the colony's labor needs were largely met by enslaved Africans. Dodge the hijack.
And so there are two sources of labor in colonial Virginia. The first of these being indentured servants. These were poor Europeans who agreed to a fixed term of forced labor in return for their passage across the Atlantic. So that's why it's called an indenture, because it's a type of contract between two individuals or groups. Well, at the very beginning, there were more indentured servants than African slaves. In fact, at the very beginning, there were 0 African slaves.
0.
All right, so real quick, just want to say let's dodge the hijack with the African, but shout out to Tom Ritchie for this history lesson. And again, as he was saying, it was indentured servants. All right, in the beginning, there was no no African slaves at all. There was no slaves. It was all indentured servants. Remember?
And slavery kind of gradually became institutionalized in colonial Virginia until finally it was decided that slaves were the property of their masters for life. First, slaves were actually treated like indentured servants.
All right, so this is the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science by Herbert B. Adams, the editor. It says history is past politics and politics are present history. Freeman. 13th series. All right, and it's called White Servitude in Virginia. Yes, white servitude in Virginia. Oh, you thought it was just a little article here and there.
You know, what is this? White servitude in colonial America. It says white servitude. Again, they're only saying white because they're Europeans, not because they're pale skinned. This is a modern interpretation of what they're trying to teach you in these books. So again, they're referring to all these Europeans collectively as white or white servitude. But we know, right? We've shown the evidence, we've shown the books, we've shown the genealogy, we've shown the historical coat of arms, the historical stewards, the historical so-called black nobility of Europe, right? And everybody else that was over there, the Huguenots, Sephardic Jews, the Moors that got expelled. We've shown all that. What happened to them? All right, let's see.
A study of the system of indentured labor in the American colonies by James Curtis Bala. All right, white servitude in the colony of Virginia, 1895. And we're in.
All right, so real quick again, Dodge the hijack. They're saying white servitude. They mean European servitude. All right, not just pale skin. Yes, there was pale skin. Yes, but they're leaving out. They want you to assume. They want you to only picture pale skin people. So break the spell. All right. Wow. When I'm reading this, picture people of color going through this too.
10 in the introduction, it tells you that the object of the present paper then is to show first the purely colonial development of an institution which both legally and socially was distinct from the institution of slavery, which grew up independently by its side, though the two institutions mutually affected and modified each other to some degree. All right. Second, that it proved an important factor in the social and economic development of the colonies and conferred a great benefit on England and other portions of Europe in offering a partial solution of their problem of the unemployed. Now remember, they were sending their undesirables, the poor people in the street, the bums, homeless people, convicts. So they were getting rid of all these people. So they were finding a way to do that by putting them as indentured servants and sending them to America. Right? So it says when Lord Delaware came in 1610 with fresh supplies, he thoroughly organized the colony as a labor force under the commanders and overseers. Dale afterwards applied a rigorous military system adopted from the Low Countries and enforced it with great severity in carrying out his plans for establishing new plantations. The colonists were marched to their daily work in squads and companies under officers, people, colonists, Europeans, not talking about African slaves here. All right. And the severest penalties were prescribed for a breach of discipline or neglect of duty. A persistent neglect of labor was to be punished by galley service from 1 to 3 years. Penal servitude was also instituted for petty offenses. They worked as slaves in irons for a term of years. In irons and chains, the planters affirmed that there were continual whippings and extraordinary punishments, such as hangings. Who's getting hanged first? You see, who's getting whipped? Hanged. Right? Shooting, breaking on the wheel, and even burning alive. They were burning these people alive, but it is likely they must exaggerate the state of affairs. So they were sending so many people here, even before 1619. Since 1607, they were trying to set this up. They had different ways they were trying to do it. This book explains. Eventually, the growth of a class of strictly indented servants was also a factor in the failure of this tenantship. Servants were much less costly and rapidly became more profitable. 50 servants were sent to serve the public in 1619, and in the next year, 100 more, say the records, to be disposed of among the old planters, which they exceedingly desire, and will pay the company their charges with very great thanks. These men had been selected with great care, but the company was unfortunate in being forced by the repeated orders of King James, all right, good old King James, to add a number of dissolute persons whom he was determined by the exercise of a mere prerogative to remove from England as undesirable class. See, He didn't want these people over there. They were sending them, they were dumping them over here in America, on these undesirable people. The new life, which began in Virginia in the year 1619, greatly encouraged industry and husbandry and led to a large increase of independent proprietaries in a few years. Special inducements were offered by large grants of land and exceptional privileges to associations of planters and adventurers for the establishment of separate plantations. Liberal grants were also made to tradesmen and to members of the company in proportions to their shares. To encourage immigration, additional grants were made to them for every person transported to the colony in the next 7 years. A large number of servants and tenants was needed on these plantations, and for some time the importation by private persons was larger than that by the company. All right, so they can't even count all the people that were brought privately. You hear what they're saying, right?
So now we come to the modern period, and we have this absurd stereotype which denotes black skin with servitude. And it's absurd. It's a folly. So I'm bringing the good news to black people that they are not of any more of a slave race than whites have been. Well, white slaves had to endure hundreds of lashes, and many of them died of that. But another way of penalizing them was to add time onto their length of service. If you ran away a day, that was a month of additional service. If you ran away for a month, that was a year of additional service. If you stole from your master, that could be months of additional service. If you had a corrupt master and the courts of assize listened more to the master than they did to you, he could have all kinds of trumped up charges against you, as happened in the Caribbean and has happened in the United States in the tobacco plantations. And it meant that in reality, it boiled down to a lifetime of enslavement under the euphemism of indentures. A lifetime of enslavement under the euphemism of indentures.
All right, so we're in this other book, all right? I had to borrow this, couldn't even download this. You know, they don't want you, even want you to have this. So it says White Servitude in Colonial America, an economic analysis by David Gelson.
Again, European servitude.
White servitude was one of the major institutions in the economy and society of colonial British America. Major institution, white servitude. Indentured English men and women constituted the principal labor supply for many of the early British settlements in the New World. All right, we're not talking about Africans. They told you all your life it was Africans. All right, but that was wrong. That's Kunta Kinte. That's roots fictional stories, plagiarized fictional stories. And their successors continued to make up an important part of white immigration to the British colonies in America throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. All right, they were coming in as what? Servants, indentured servants. All right. Yet those bound immigrants who arrived in the West Indies or the Chesapeake in the first half of the 17th century performed a very different role in the colonial labor market than did the indentured servants who came to British America in the middle of the 18th century. This book provides a description of the evolution of the economic function of white servitude in colonial America, based on an examination of detailed evidence about the population of bound immigrants and analysis the sources of this process through the use of an explanatory framework designed to provide an understanding of the determinants of the major changes that occurred over in time in the composition of colonial labor forces. In this way, this book is intended to produce both a thorough portrayal and an explanation of the causes underlying a dramatic episode of early American history in which hundreds of thousands European men and women of the 17th and 18th century voluntarily sold themselves into bondage for a period of years in order to become part of the earliest stream of immigrants from the old world to the new. All right? Again, did you understand that? Hundreds of thousands of Europeans, they came in as what? Into bondage. They volunteered themselves into bondage, into Egypt. They came back into Egypt, right? Into bondage for a period of years. Contract. to become part of the early stream of immigrant. Slavery played no part in the plans of the early colonizers of British America. All right, slavery wasn't around; it didn't exist. It wasn't in their mind. They came in with their English laws, which was indentured servitude. They also copied this from the Spaniards, their encomienda and repartimiento system that they had with the as Aborigines as well in the islands in Central America and Mexico, South America. Again, slavery played no part in the plans of the early colonizers of British America. The use of bound white laborers preceded the use of black slaves. So the use of bound white laborers preceded the use of black slaves in every British American colony, in every colony, all right?
And a constitutional system dedicated to the defense of legalized chattel slavery in our Constitution in 1789 could become transformed into an abolitionist project in 1865. That accomplishment was neither easy nor inevitable. It was a product of sustained resistance, ideological battle, consciousness raising, brilliant organizing, and ultimately a war of national liberation and preservation led by Black citizen slaves and white freemen. But few commentators have spent much time pondering the significance of the abolition of indentured servitude in the 13th Amendment. That admission seems reasonable when we consider that few indentured servants remained in the United States in 1865, as most courts had refused to criminalize breach of contract after the 1830s. And yet the abolition of indentured servitude, along with slavery, of course, would have profound implications and consequences for the American nation. For starters, consider the dramatic divergence between the United States and Great Britain, its anti-slavery rival, which after its abolition of slavery in 1833, enlivened regimes of indenture and expanded global systems of unfree labor across its empire and across the 19th century. Consider also the power of an anti-trafficking coalition within the 13th Amendment. By anti-trafficking, I mean the abolition of buying and selling people, which is not the same as slavery. It certainly is commensurate with it. That is, in fact, what is so startling about the 13th Amendment in many respects, is that it abolished both kinds of traffic. Linked explicitly here for the first time in US law were the common interests of indentured servants and slaves in not being bought or sold. You can read the servant and slave codes from their origin as trying to drive a wedge between servants and slaves. And here in the 13th Amendment, they come together beautifully.
All right, I know it sounds like a little mumbo jumbo there, but the guy is going to get to a point later on, and we're going to read it as well. But he's basically letting us know that these first abolitionists, we're going to read later on, you know, the whole American Revolutionary War, it had a purpose. And the main reason these people's freedom, the freedom they were really fighting for, it was their indenture. They were bounded. Most of these people were convicts, prisoners. We're just beginning right now. We're going to read all this. They were fighting for their freedom. It wasn't about no country and, oh, let's fight for America. No, they were fighting for their own freedom. A lot of these people got land grants after they did time in the war. All right, so that was their indenture to come fight in the war. That was how they paid their transportation over here. And if they survived, they got land. A lot of these people ended up in the southeast of US today, where there's so-called Black communities today. And there's been Black communities for like 200 years. Right? So where did all these indentured servant people, these American Revolutionary hero soldiers, they got land grants all over these areas. If they're white, where did they go, all of them? Should be more white.
Where did these slaves come from? Where were they drawn from?
Well, primarily from Great Britain. It was remarked in one of the chronicles that I found that Scotland was a veritable industry for white slavery. In the 17th century, white parents were afraid to bring their children to the ports of Scotland for fear of what has come to be known as press gangs. Again, the historians have distorted this and implied that impressment only operated for recruiting people on board British men of war as sailors. That's not true. In the original annals, you find that press gangs operated to kidnap children and adults on board these ships, and it was a veritable industry with the cooperation of the authorities. It began in the very early or the very late Elizabethan era, when the Elizabethan geographer Halkut suggested that the only way they were going to people these plantations was with bondsmen. But the actual machinery of it and where it was really put into effect en masse came in the Stuart dynasty and under the King Charles I in the early 17th century.
We're going to get the info now that we're clear that not all Europeans were white. There was many so-called black Europeans, and a lot of these were the ones getting caught in this indenture middle passage, this involuntary or voluntary middle passage, prisoners of war, convicts, colonization, you know, all right? So let's get on with the info.
All right, so now I want to get into this book. It's written by Bernard Bailyn. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author of Voyagers to the West. And this particular book we're getting into is called The Barbarous Years, The Peopling of British North America, The Conflict of Civilizations, 1600, 1675. So what I did is I bought the Kindle version because they don't show you any preview of it and it's hard to get anywhere. So, thanks to your donations, I'm able to get stuff. So we begin here. It says the third group of Anglo-Dutch religious radicals to settle in Virginia was initially the most tragic. All right, so what are they talking about? So Anglo-Dutch religious radicals, these are indentured servants, most of them. Of the 180 passengers from the embattled Elder, Francis Blackwell led from Amsterdam to Virginia. No fewer than 130, including Blackwell himself, died on that voyage of 7 months. They had been packed together, it was reported, like herrings. They had amongst them the flux and also want of fresh water. So as it is here, London wondered at that so many are alive, then that so many are dead. All right, so again, they were what? Packed together like herrings. Talking about people packed in ships. We ain't talking about Africans. Or if you want to talk about a slave ship and people, a middle passage, right? So you got to include these people too. And they all died too. Now, were all these white people? That's to debate. They're talking about Anglo-Dutch religious radicals. That doesn't talk about complexion right there. Continuing down here, it says the horror of Blackwell's notorious voyage was only an extreme example of the miseries of the transportation and resettlement process of those years. For most of the voyagers, emigration was a shocking experience. For some, it was as deadly as it was for Blackwell's pilgrims. The Virginia Company published guidelines for the supplies necessary for such voyages, but did nothing to enforce them, with the result that the provisions on board were so poor that they became a subject of complaint to the Privy Council. The voyages of these small, ill-equipped rocking vessels lasted 2 or 3 months. Food and drink were bad, stinkish beer in quality and short in quantity. Sanitation was primitive, and sickness swept through the passengers like deadly storms. So, you hear this? Each year, each shipping season, many died at sea. Most of the carefully recruited iron workers were lost on a single voyage. Okay, we're not talking about Africans here in this moment. The survivors were so weakened by disease and exhaustion that they quickly fell victim to debilitating attacks of dysentery and other afflictions. Whole shiploads that had been sent over to work on various public enterprises had to be transferred to whatever private plantations would take them, simply to assure their survival. You hear this? And the guest houses of which Sandy spoke so happily did not exist. Only one building, 40 feet by 20, is known to have been built for that purpose. And so, since it is mortal for newcomers to lie on the ground, the hundreds of new arrivals had to be added to the crowds that already filled the small, flimsy dwellings that were being hastily constructed. Even that might have been tolerable if the timing of the voyages had been right. But despite bitter protests from Virginia, the vessels typically left England early in the spring and arrived at the worst possible time, at the beginning of the hot season and before the year's harvest had come in. So they would send these people right when it was time to actually gather the harvest and go, go into winter. They actually needed these people more. It would be more logical to send them during the springtime when they're planting so they can help out, right? Partake in the work and get their fruits from it. The constant, often unexpected arrivals of shiploads after shipload of sickly, disoriented passengers in a climate that was debilitatingly hot and humid, lacking supplies to carry them over the first phase of resettlement, destined to be housed in crowded huts until they could be distributed, often to places other than their intended destinations. All of this brought repeated outcries from the resident leaders. I pray, Sir Governor George Yearly, 1618-21, wrote Sandys, give me both time to provide means and to build and, and settle before you send one load after another. Stop sending these ships, they're telling him, man. Give us some time. We're talking about ships after ships, right? Shipload after shipload. Not talking about slave ships from Africa here. Talking about Europeans coming as indentured servants, convicts, undesirables, right? But let's not forget all this. We continue. New land policy and tenant farmers of absentee landowners assisted by indentured servants. All right, indentured servants. All right, that's who by 1617 a model structure had emerged. All right, they had the plan, they had the blueprint. We need We need to do this with indentured servants. We're gonna get them from the undesirables and the convicts we don't want, and all those poor people we don't want over there. Adventurers do land for their investments began to pool their grants to create larger and more efficient units of production. Smith's Hundred, founded that year, which combined the land claims of leading figures in the company, became a virtual colonizing company of its own, financed by a terminable joint stock and complete with a private labor force of indentured servants, a private labor force of indentured servants, not African slaves. We're talking about plantations, we're talking about tobacco plantations, indentured servants, and this included also American Aboriginal Indians they were bringing in from the Caribbean and local ones they had already put into servitude and indenture. Right, so when they show us these tobacco fields with so-called Negroes, growing it, it's not Africans. This was done with indentured servants. So dodge the hijack. This is real history. All right, so now we're on page 130. We're going to talk about the passengers on this ship, the Ark and the Dove. All right, it's about 1634. We're going to go to the next page. It talks about the list. It says the rest of the passengers, most of them Protestants, right? Protestants, remember who's the Protestants? We already know. So remember, we're indentured or paid servants. So remember when they telling us Protestant settled here, religious freedom, well, they had to find a way to get over. It wasn't like they all had money to come over, so they had to indenture themselves for the passage over here. So these Protestants were indentured or paid servants. One of them black, one of them a Protestant, one of them black. What does that mean? So-called black. One of the Protestants is black. One a Portuguese mulatto, some artisans, and a few independent farmers. Now, are we supposed to assume that this one black, supposedly one black, is an African? That's the hijack, right? They're letting you know something here. Two Jesuit priests, Andrew White and John Alton, and a lay brother completed the shipboard list, sharply divided between gentry and laborers, most of whom were indentured servants. The first settling group conformed reasonably well to Calvert's social expectations. 165 of this book, it says approximately 100,000 Britons, of the great majority English, are known to have migrated to the Tobacco Coast in the 17th century. All right? Britons in the Tobacco Coast, Britons, not Africans, at least 70% of them, and probably 85% came as indentured servants, 85% slaves, bonded for service. They were at work in the oldest settled areas as in the newest, arriving year after year on veritable convoys of ships from the major English ports. Middlesex County, between the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers, a contemporary road, was a sea of servants. All right, a sea of servants. We're not talking about Africans. 45% of that country's entire population were servants in 1668, and the same could have been said of other countries. Who were these tens of thousands of voluntary bonded servants? Tens of thousands, hundred thousands. Where are their descendants? This is a lot of people. Imagine. So why would they need, if they're hiring contracts, you know, why would they be doing that if they got free labor from Africans? It's a business. It's a corporation. You see, who were the tens of thousands of voluntary bonded servants? Where were they from? And were their backgrounds? What were their backgrounds? What were the differences and similarities among them? How did they live in this strange environment? What would become of them when they were released from service? In the book says the most debased, possibly 40% of the total, were the youngest, the least skilled, and most destitute. They shipped out without the protection of legal indentures and served, therefore, according to the harsh terms of extemporized contracts that followed Virginia's local custom. And we're on page 308 of this book, and this part is talking about Irish travails in Fort Christina, a settlement renamed to Altona. And it says that the population, about 600 souls, many of them rough people, as poor as worms and lazy withal. Only a few of them qualified farmers, fell victim to the damp climate made more miserable by a sequence of heavy rains that ruined the winter fodder. A hot intermittent fever and dysentery became epidemic. About 100 people, many of them children, and died, and the diseases were compounded by the arrival of 108 more settlers on the mill. So on top of what they were going through, they were dumping more convicts, more people with disease, more people undesirables on top of them. All right, 11 of whose companions had succumbed to scurvy on the passage, three of whom died on landing. The survivors, especially the indentured orphan children, indentured, taken from Amsterdam's almshouses, were suffering from a variety of illnesses, some contagious, and they brought with them no supplies. But recruitment continued in Finland and especially in the farming districts of Gelderland and Holland. All right, we're talking about Dutch, German, Finnish people, indentured servants too. These type of Europeans, not just English, Scottish, or Irish. Remember, all of Europeans we're bringing over here. In the book, Redemptioneers and Indentured Servants in the Colony and Commonwealth of Pennsylvania by Carl Frederick Geiser from 1901. A single example from the Pennsylvania Gazette on May 9, 1751, may here serve as a characteristic illustration. And it says, from that time, an ad, right? It says, run away from Thomas James of Upper Merion, Philadelphia County. On the 5th of this an Irish servant lad named William Dubbin, about 18 years of age, speaks good English, fresh colored and thick and well set in his body, has light colored curled hair, somewhat resembling a wig, had on when he went away an old felt hat, Ozenbrick shirt and old dark brown colored coat, too big for him, and breeches of the same, gray worsted stockings, and a pair of old shoes with brass buckles. One of the buckles broke. Whoever takes up and seizes this servant so that his master may have him again shall have 20 shillings reward, and reasonable charges paid by Thomas Jones.
And we continue in the book, White Servitude in the Colony of Virginia, a study of the system of indentured labor in the American colonies. All right, 1895, I believe. We're in chapter 2 now. The servitude thus developed was limited and conditional. With respect to its origin, it was of two kinds, resting on distinct principles. First, voluntary servitude based on free contract with the London Company or with private persons for definite terms of service in consideration of the servant's transportation and maintenance during servitude. Second, involuntary servitude, where legal authority condemned a person to a term of servitude judged necessary for his reformation or prevention from an idle course of life, or as a reprieve from other punishment for misdemeanors already committed. All right, so again, they were sending convicts, or they were picking up these spiriting, actually kidnapping, spirited these people, you know, involuntarily and sending them to America, dumping them over here. Convicts, poor people, undesirables. So though involuntary on the part of the servant, this kind involved a contract. So even though these people were being forced to come over here involuntarily, they still were getting a contract, imposing the sentence on the person that undertook the transportation of the offender. And the master's right to service resting upon the terms of this contract made or assigned to him was practically on the same footing as involuntary servitude. The great body of servants was comprised in the former class. They were free persons, largely from England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. You hear this? All right. These are your slaves. These are your first indentured servants who wished to go to the colony as settlers to better their condition, but were too poor to bear the charges of their transportation. They consequently entered into a voluntary contract with anyone that would assume these charges and their maintenance for such a term of years as would repay the outlay, placing themselves for this limited time at the disposal of the person for any reasonable service. The contract was made in Great Britain with resident planters or the agents of colonists, but more frequently with shipmasters who traded in Virginia and disposed of the servant on their arrival as they saw fit. The agreement was by deed indented, and hence arose the term indented servants. This class of so-called kids was supplemented by a smaller class of persons who went on agreements for fixed wages for a definite time. The other large class was supplied chiefly from English paupers, vagrants, and dissolute persons, sent under the arbitrary exercise of royal prerogative or by court sentences, and later by the action of English penal statutes. In the earlier years, it included a large number of poor children from the counties and towns of England who were sent to apprenticeship on easy conditions. The penal regulations of the colony up to the year 1642 tended also to recruit this class, A very large number of the convicts sent to the American plantations were political and not social criminals. Of the Scotch prisoners taken at the Battle of Worcester, 1,610 were sent to Virginia in 1651. 2 years later, 100 Irish Tories were sent, and in 1685, a number of the followers of Monmouth that had escaped the cruelties of Jeffreys. Many of the Scotch prisoners of Dunbar and of the rebels of 1666 were sent to New England and other plantations. As early as 1611, Governor Dale, anxious to fill out the number of 2,000 men for establishing military posts along James River, had recommended that all convicts from the common jails be kept up for 3 years. They are not always, he said, the worst kind of men, either for birth, spirit, or body, and would be glad to escape a just sentence and make this their new country. Oh, they would be glad to not be criminals anymore and get to go free in America so they can do their criminal acts over there, right? And plan therein with all diligence, cheerfulness, and comfort. Yeah, sure. Not all these comics were good, I don't think. This request passed unheeded, and the earliest introduction of any of the criminal class seems to have been in 1618. All right? They're sending criminals over here. A strict system of search was applied to every ship that entered Virginia ports, and for the next half century, the colony had a respite from this class of Newgaters and jailbirds. Their transportation was now diverted to the West Indies. Also, it's not like they stopped sending them, they just started sending them to the West Indies instead. But this proved so ineffectual in putting a stop to petty felonies that in the fourth year of George I, 1717, Parliament passed a statute over the most vigorous protest from the Virginia merchants in London, making the American colonies practically a reformatory and a dumping ground for the felons of England. So they brought it back in 1717. Nope, that is the dumping ground for the felons of England. Again, pay attention, people. Please remember this. When you see an American who says, "Oh, I descend from England," right? Well, your ancestor might have been a felon, and he was dumped here. He was considered a felon in England. He was dumped here because he was a felon.
Damn,
They needed to work. They needed
mail
indentured
robbed.
servants. So you can tell them that. Have you done your genealogy and studied that? Ask them that. All right, because this was a dumping ground for the felons of England. All right, this is an official scholarly book with sources, real history here. In 1766, the benefits of this act were extended to include Scotland through Benjamin Franklin on the part of Pennsylvania, memorialized Parliament against it, and in 1768, the more speedy transportation of felons was ordered. Look at how many felons they're sending over here. So how many of these indentured servants that came here, how many really were felons? Wow. You see why they came here with that evilness, with that nature, to not care to take your town, to kill you, take your whole, rape your women, eat up all your corn, not care, dig up your graves, eat them, right? Like eat your ancestors because they were so hungry, going hungry, digging up your graves and stuff. This stuff they did. All right, these felons. The practice was only stopped by the War of the Revolution. The preamble of the Act of 1779 significantly remarks that whereas the transportation of felons to His Majesty's American colonies is attended with many difficulties, they are now to be sent to other parts beyond the sea, whether situated in America or not. I went another book from the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science, and this is White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820 by Eugene Irvin McCormick, PhD, instructor in American History, University of California, and this is from 1904. As nearly all indentures were negotiable, they were regularly disposed of at auction or private sale. The following is an example of the notices which appeared in the papers whenever a servant ship arrived in port. It says here, just arrived in the ship Sophia, Alexander Berdine, master from Dublin, 20 stout, healthy, indented men, servants with 20 people, it says, whose indentures will be disposed of on reasonable terms by the captain on board or the subscriber, etc. The price received for servants varied according to their skill, age, and other personal qualities, but the average price for adults seems to have been about 15 to 20 pounds, all right? People from Europe being sold, right? Like property, people being sold. The Jews and Moors in Spain, Iberia. This is by Rabbi Jos Kruzkov, chapter 17, The Dispersion of the Jews. Thus mournfully closed the last chapter. These are sad words fraught with anguish and despair.
Yet, however sad, however despondent and hopeless, however much of grief and anguish and despair they convey, they befell the Jews of Spain, and they fell altogether when they are asked to describe the sufferings and miseries which met the unfortunate exiles everywhere in their fruitless search for a quiet spot where they might live or die in peace. Ships stood ready in the harbors to carry nearly all of the banished 300,000 Jews, whithersoever it suited the captains best. All right, so again, these are moderate numbers because we're talking about they were very prosperous for hundreds of years with the Moors. All right, so we have others, scholars that will question these numbers and talk about millions, right? Now it says here, into these ships, exiles were literally packed, all right, literally packed in ships, crowded together without regard to sex or age, often mother torn from child, husband from wife, brother from sister, friends from friends, and separated on the coast meant separation forever. Words and the heart fail me to speak of the heart-rending cries of parent for child and child for parent, of husband for wife and wife for husband, or of the wailing and lamenting as Spain, the land of their birth, the home of their comfort and luxury and blessings. All right, Spain, not Africa, right? Spain, not Africa, Spain, place of their birth, slowly faded out of sight and finally disappeared beneath the horizon. All right, now you tell me if that don't sound like what happened to Kunta Kinte in the so-called African slave stories, how they were snatching people, separating families, babies from their moms. All right, now we're talking about a real history here. So this is further on in the book, what they were doing to them when they were putting them in the ships. It says, no sooner were they on high sea, when men and women and children were ordered on deck, commanded to disrobe publicly, regardless of innocence of youth and modesty of sex. Many a virgin and many a youth, many a husband and many a wife dared to resist. Not that they had money concealed, but for shame's sake. And the raging billows rocked them into their eternal sleep for their resistance. All right, they killed them. Disappointed in their search, their thirst for gold was more excited. Body after body they ripped open before the eyes of unfortunate exiles in the belief that they must have swallowed their gold and precious jewels. And disappointed in this, there followed a scene, a more detestable and dastardly one the sun never shone upon. All right, you hear that cruelty going on? These are people of color, right? From Spain. It says when the sailors had finally satiated their brutal lust upon the innocents and helpless and faint from terror and torture, and when the still surviving victims had been made to cleanse the ships from every trace of the blood of their friends and kin, they were seized and dropped into the ocean without a pang of conscience, and as unconcernedly as if the great God had created Jews for no other purpose but to appease the beastly appetites of inhuman sailors and serve as food for the fishes of the sea. All right? Again, these Catholics are doing this, right? It's a religious warfare. Deep, it's not about complexion. Another captain was somewhat more merciful, whether he had to expiate some of his tender heartedness by humiliating penance. Ecclesiastical history has neglected to record. He set all his exiles on the shore upon a desert coast, leaving the weak and the suffering pitilessly a prey to wild beasts and to starvation. One of these unfortunate deserted exiles who survived tells us how he saw his wife perish before his eyes, how he himself fainted with exhaustion, and upon awakening beheld his two children dead by his side. For weeks, roots and grass furnished their food. Each day brought fresh miseries and fresh graves. These were days such as Shakespeare speaks of. Each new morning, new windows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strive heaven on the face. It says mothers unable to bear the pinning of their children struck them dead. All right. I know a lot of you read scripture. Hey, I don't know if this is sounding familiar. So mothers unable to bear the pain of their children struck them dead and then took their own life. Whole families folded themselves in love and embrace, and while thus embracing, ended their life with their own hand. When the wind beast came upon them, the exiles plunged into the sea and stood shivering in the water for hours and hours until the beast retreated. Warily they made their way onward until at last they beheld the joyous sight of human settlements. Exhausted, they lay along the coast, wasted by suffering and disease, and half demented from starvation. Down to the shore came the priest, and holding a crucifix in one hand and provisions in the other. The unfortunate Jews were given the choice between Christ and starvation. So you choose Christ or you die. Convert or die. That's the Inquisition. Another shipload was cast out by a barbarous captain upon the African coast. So listen to this. People, Sephardic Jews being brought to African coast, right? Are reversed, where the African savages pounced down upon them and abandoned themselves to fight for cruelties. You heard what happened when they dumped them in Africa? West Africa, where they're supposed to, a lot of these Hebrew Israelite camps, attacking me, telling me, oh, you're, they're coming from what, it's actually in reverse a lot of this time. A lot of those were Sephardic Jews that were being taken as slaves or just servants or just being dumped in West Africa, you know? The men and Jews they sold into slavery. The defenseless women were brutally ravished. You know what that means. The children of their mother's breasts, the aged and the sick and the infirm were mutilated and tortured and murdered by the thousands. That's on the African coast. Another shipload landed in the harbor of Genoa, all right, Italy. A graphic picture of their suffering is given by Genoese historian and eyewitness of the scenes, which he describes as follows. No one says he could behold the sufferings of the Jewish exiles unmoved. A great many perished of hunger, especially those of tender years. Mothers with scarcely enough strength to support themselves carried their famished infants in their arms and died with them. Many fell victims to the cold, others to intense thirst, while the unaccustomed distress incident to a sea voyage aggravated their maladies.
All right, so we're in this other book now by Don Jordan and Michael Walsh, and it's called White Cargo, The Forgotten History of Britain's White Slaves in America.
We're just talking about European servitude.
Slaughtered in America for gold. The English in America had to plant for their wealth. Failing to find the expected mineral riches along the eastern seaboard, they turned to farming, hoping they can make gold from tobacco. They needed a compliant, subservient, preferably free labor force, and since the indigenous peoples of America were difficult to enslave, they turned to their own homeland to provide. All right, they got their own English slaves, not Africans. They imported Britons deemed to be surplus people. All right, Britons, they talking about the originals, the dark skin. All right, remember, I know they're talking about white people here, but they also imported anybody who didn't want. So that even black Britons too. The rootless, the unemployed, the criminals, and the dissident, and held them in the Americas in various forms of bondage for anything from 3 years to life. This book tells the story of these victims of empire. They were all supposed to gain their freedom eventually. For many, it didn't work out that way. In the early decades, half of them died in bondage. This book tracks the evolution of the system in which tens of thousands of whites, not Africans, were held as chattel, marketed like cattle, not Africans, whites, punished brutally and in some cases literally worked to death. For decades, this underclass was treated just as savagely as black slaves, and indeed toiled, suffered, and rebelled alongside them. Right, whites running away, getting hanged, getting whipped, lashes, all that. Eventually, a racial wedge was thrust between white and black. Something happened, leaving blacks officially enslaved and whites apparently upgraded, but in reality, just as enslaved as they were before. You understand what happened? Eventually, there was a racial wedge, and among the first to be sent were children. Some were dispatched by impoverished parents seeking a better life for them, but others were forcibly deported. Forcibly. In 1618, the authorities in London began to sweep up hundreds of troublesome urchins from the slums and, ignoring protests from the children and their families, shipped them to Virginia. England's richest man was behind this mass expulsion. It was presented as an act of charity. The starving children were to be given a new start as apprentices in America. In fact, they were sold to planters to work in the fields, and half of them were dead within a year. Shipments of children continued from England and then from Ireland for decades. Many of these migrants were little more than toddlers. In 1661, the wife of a man who imported 4 Irish boys into Maryland as servants wondered why her husband had not brought some cradles to have rocked them in, as they were so little. A second group of forced migrants from the mother country were those such as vagrants and petty criminals, all right? They were sending mad criminals over here, whom English rulers wished to get rid of. The legal ground was prepared for their relocation by a highwayman turned Lord Chief Justice who argued for England's gaols to be emptied in America. Thanks to men like him, 50,000 to 70,000 convicts, all right, or maybe more, were transported to Virginia, Maryland, Barbados, and England's other American possessions before 1776. All right, before 1776. All manner of others considered undesirable by the British Crown were also dispatched across the Atlantic to be sold in servitude. They ranged from beggars to prostitutes, Quakers to cavaliers. All right, all the people, anybody they didn't want over there, undesirable. So they were sending them too. They were undesirable. So a lot of you people got, whatever, English, Irish, in your family's census, and you go back to English people. They might have been actually so-called black people, not white people. These were black indentured Europeans. All right.
Races. And there were still people profiting from white bondage. What did end with the beginning of the American Revolutionary War against the British Crown was transportation, which is a technical term used by the British for bringing so-called white criminals from Britain and dumping them in the United States. Benjamin Franklin greatly protested that, and that was in fact one of the colonists' grievances. However, I believe that it was also an alibi because the Waltham Black Act of 1723 had criminalized a great number of petty misdemeanors and made them capital offenses. In other words, Britain was teeming with a white population of poor people that it couldn't handle, and it needed to get them off the island. So by criminalizing these petty offenses, you were then able to say, we sentence you to death. However, as for stealing a teaspoon, or a loaf of bread, or cutting down trees on an aristocrat's grounds, or poaching a deer. However, as a mercy of the British Crown, we will transport you for life into slavery in the British Crown colony of America. When the American Revolution erupted, the British Crown then had to switch their dumping ground from America to Australia, and that's how Australia was founded.
All right, so before we continue, I just wanted to, I know it was really quick. He mentioned that Benjamin Franklin was complaining about this, how they were just bringing all these Germans and Europeans and all that. I don't know if you guys remember, right? Benjamin Franklin was actually saying these were swarthy. Why are we going to Germanize America with more German, swarthy Germans, with these Boers? He called them Boers. And he said the Scottish, the Spanish, all these people were swarthy. He said America was swarthy as well. He said all of Asia was swarthy. Right, so he just mentioned them, and yes, he did do that. You can look that up. Again, we're just learning about a true middle passage here. We just learned about the true middle passage here. Let's continue.
And this book is called Colonists in Bondage, White Servitude and Convict Labor in America, 1607 to 1776. Now, it reaches that year, but we know that it actually continued after that. Abbott Emerson Smith is the author. It says a search and exploration of a very profitable and frequently criminal trade and its impact on colonial life before the Revolution. So we're in part 1 again, chapter 1, Indentured Servants and Redemptioneers. This book is about those white people who went to the British colonies in North America and who, because they were unwilling or unable to pay the cost of their own passage, became bond servants for a period of years to some colonial master who paid it for them. All right, so we've already gone over this. We understand now what indentured servitude and the whole passage and why they had to be bound or be servants for 7 years, because they couldn't pay for it on their own. And doesn't always mean that these people were willingly coming either. So a lot of these people were being forced. So somebody had to pay for their transportation. All right. They were variously known as indentured servants, redemptioneers, or in order to distinguish them from the Negroes, as Christians or white servants. Many of them were convicts from the jails, transported instead of being hanged. A few were political and military prisoners, taken in war or rebellion. There were rogues, vagabonds, whores, cheats, and rabble of all descriptions, racked from the gutter and kicked out of the country. All right, all their undesirables, all these people that were just trying to get rid of, criminals, all these people, man, that they were just dumping over here. It's no wonder why they did the things they did when they got here. There were unfortunate French, German, and Swiss Protestants, fleeing from religious persecution, starving and unhappy Irish, rag-rented Scottish farmers, poverty-stricken German peasants and artisans, brash adventurers of all sorts. People of every age and kind were decoyed, deceived, seduced, inveigled, or forcibly kidnapped and carried as servants to the plantation, all right? They were kidnapping people. Now, they told you they were going to Africa kidnapping people, all right? Now you see why this dude who wrote Roots, the original, I'm talking about the African, the one Alex Haley plagiarized, where he get all these ideas from. People getting kidnapped and brought to America to work in a plantation. This was happening to white people first, Europeans first. I'm not talking about slavery, I'm talking about in the Americas. When you're talking about setting up a colony, setting up an economy, building a town, you need free labor. In the Americas, this was done with indentured service, not African slaves, not in the beginning. And even at the end, we already know there is no proof. Where's the slave ship? You guys were already here. They were grabbing you from here. They had the labor force here. They didn't have to go spend money, bring a ship all the way to Africa, risk the adventure, the company, the business, and then bring Africans over here when you were already here. All right, they made you into an indentured servant. They did that to the Indians. We already got all these videos. Got like 5 videos on that with all scholarly sources. Go back if you're new to my channel. There were many ordinary individuals of decent substance, and a few even who were entitled by the custom of time to be called gent. All right, so he's trying to water it down a little bit. He said, well, there were some regular people. More than half of all persons who came to the colonies south of New England were servants. Again, you're a white American. You're most likely a descendant of a servant, a convict, or anything like that was sent over here, a vagabond. You read. From the complex pattern of forces produced in emigration to the American colonies, one stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them, put them in ships. Labor was one of the few European importations which even the earliest colonists would sacrifice much to procure, and the system of indentured servitude was the most convenient system, next to slavery, by which labor became a commodity to be bought and sold. Labor or your service was a commodity to be bought and sold. It was profitable for English merchants trading to the colonies to load their outgoing ships with a cargo of servants. Load what? Their ships? Load their ships with servants? What servants? English, Irish, Scottish, all these undesirables. Not Africans.